This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating story unfolding right now in Nepal.
That's right.
It's about, well, a nation that feels like it's on the edge of some major change. And it's not the usual players driving it. It's this incredibly vibrant, sometimes surprising, new generation. We're going to try and unpack how young Nepalis are using, well, everything really, social media, direct action to shake up these long-standing political systems.
Yeah, they're demanding a future that, actually works for them.
Exactly.
And the sources we've looked at for this deep dive, they really paint a compelling picture. We're talking demographics, how activism itself is changing, the impact of recent elections. Huge. And also, crucially, the deep frustrations young Nepalis are dealing with every single day. So our mission really is to pull out the most important insights for you on how this whole dynamic is playing out on the ground. And I think what's key here is this isn't just about Nepal, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, it gives us these incredible insights into, well, universal themes, youth power, technology as a disruptive force, and just how unpredictable political change can be. It resonates way beyond Nepal's borders.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So, look, if you want to get a handle on this movement, you've got to rewind to Nepal's 2022 elections. Our sources, they call them a political earthquake. No exaggeration.
Not at all.
And young people were right at the epicenter. You saw campaigns like, no, not again, just explode.
Yeah.
A really direct, kind of unapologetic message of frustration aimed squarely at the political old guard, the elites who've been around for decades.
And the results, I mean, they were genuinely stunning. Take Balendra Shah, everyone calls him Balen.
Right, Balen Shah.
He gets elected mayor of Kathmandu.
Yeah.
As an independent, you have to understand, for Kathmandu, this was seismic, a massive blow to the establishment parties.
A young guy, no party backing, takes the capital.
Exactly. And then you also see the rapid rise of completely new political groups like the Rastriya Swatantra Party, the RSP.
Right.
These weren't just blips on the radar. These victories showed a generation saying, okay, enough. We're taking control of our future now.
And when you look at the demographics, it just makes sense why this generation has so much potential power. Nepal is, truly a young country.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers are stark. People aged 16 to 40, they make up a massive 40.68% of the total population.
Right.
That's what we call a youth bulge.
40%. Wow.
And electorally.
Yeah.
Even more significant. That same age group is over half, about 52% of all voters. Now, on paper, this demographic dividend, it should be this amazing engine for development, right? New energy, new ideas.
You'd think so.
But, and this is the crucial but our sources highlight, if the hopes of these young people aren't met, if the system fails them, that same failure could fuel serious social and political instability.
And looking at the economy, it's not hard to see why those hopes might be getting dashed, is it?
Precisely. Youth unemployment, for instance, it's sitting at a staggering 19.2%.
19%.
Compare that to the overall national rate, which is just 2.7%.
Yeah.
It's a huge gap. This economic stagnation, it's a major, major source of discontent.
It feels like a failure to create real opportunities.
It really is. A failure to provide meaningful jobs for a generation that's increasingly educated, ambitious. And it highlights this fundamental contradiction we see in Nepal. Young people. They're the demographic majority. They're the core electorate. Yet they remain economically and politically sidelined. Get this. Only 5% of federal parliament seats are held by youth.
5%.
5. The global average is around 13.5%. So there's this huge disconnect between their numbers and their actual power.
And despite all that marginalization, what do they actually want? Is it radical?
Not at all, actually. Their priorities are incredibly pragmatic. The top 5, according to our sources, infrastructure, economic prosperity, education, health, and good governance.
Basic stuff, functional state stuff.
Exactly. They're not asking for the moon. They're asking for a system that actually works.
Okay, so you have this stark economic picture for young people, which leads us into this really interesting, almost ironic situation with remittances. A real paradox.
It really is a paradox.
Yeah.
We're talking about the remittance economy and the massive brain drain because of the political instability, the corruption, the lack of jobs. Young people are leaving in droves.
How many are we talking?
Over 100,000 young Nepalis left the country in just the last year alone. And our sources frame this not just as, an economic decision. They call it a political act.
A vote of no confidence.
Essentially, yes. A collective, we're out to the system.
But here's the twist, right? The money they send back home, it actually props up the state they're leaving.
That's the counterintuitive part. In
Right.
2023, remittances made up something like 25% of Nepal's entire GDP, a quarter.
Wow. So that money acts like a safety net.
It does, but
Yeah.
it creates this really vicious circle. The remittances provide an economic cushion, yes, but they also mask the state's deep structural weaknesses.
Ah, so less pressure to reform.
Exactly. It reduces the pressure on the ruling gerontocracy.
Yeah.
The leadership dominated by older politicians, often in their 60s, 70s, 80s, to make the tough, deep reforms needed to fix things like job creation or corruption.
Because the foreign cash keeps flowing in anyway?
Precisely. If that constant injection of foreign currency wasn't there, the government would be forced, really forced, to confront its failures more directly. So you have this deeply tragic situation where young people are protesting the system.
But inadvertently helping it survive.
They're subsidizing its survival. It's a profound national contradiction.
So given that backdrop, how has activism itself changed? Nepal has this history of youth leading change, the anti-Rana stuff, 1998, 2006 people's movements.
Right.
But wasn't that usually channeled through party student wings, like youth as foot soldiers?
That's exactly how it used to be, largely. But the digital age, well, it's completely changed the game. Social media, Facebook, X, TikTok, these are now critical tools for mobilization.
So they can bypass the old structures.
Completely bypass traditional media, often controlled by political interests, and organize without needing formal party backing. And this has led to a visible shift away from purely partisan, sometimes violent protests,
Towards what?
towards more creative, peaceful, and very issue-focused movements. And crucially, they're largely independent of the established political parties.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, a really striking one was the hashtag Enough Eyes Enough movement back in 2020.
Right, during the pandemic.
Exactly. It wasn't tied to any party. It just sprang up as this nonpartisan response to what people saw as government incompetence and corruption in handling COVID-19.
And what were they demanding?
Very concrete things. Transparency on how this huge sum, ours $10 billion allocated for the pandemic, was being spent. They wanted proper PCR tests, not unreliable ones, better quarantine conditions.
How did it start? Digitally?
It started with a Facebook group. Within a week, it had 200,000 members. Just exploded. And that online energy quickly spilled onto the streets. Peaceful sit-ins, demonstrations, people holding creative signs, singing the national anthem.
How did the government react?
Initially with a crackdown. Water cannons, arrests, the usual tactics. But the pressure was sustained, digitally amplified, and remarkably, it worked.
They got concessions.
They did.
Yeah.
The government eventually agreed to scrap the rapid tests, promised more transparency. It was a real landmark moment for this new kind of independent, digitally powered youth activism. It showed collective action outside the old channels could actually force change.
And we've seen other examples too, haven't we? Things like hashtag Backup India, tapping into national sentiment.
Yes, or hashtag Dalit Lives Matter, which cleverly localized that global conversation around racial justice to Nepal's specific issues of caste discrimination.
And hashtag Occupy Baluwater. That was about gender-based violence.
Right, which led to legislative changes and environmental activism too, like Fridays for Future taking root. It's a consistent pattern of digital mobilization around specific issues.
So what does this all signify, fundamentally?
It signifies, I think, a fundamental break. Youth are shifting from being, tools used by parties to being independent political actors in their own right.
A rejection of the old model.
A clear rejection,
Yeah.
And a deep distrust of the established parties.
Mm.
Their political identity now seems less about party loyalty and more about the specific issues that directly affect them.
Okay, but you mentioned a dark side earlier. It's not all positive.
Unfortunately, no. There's a concerning trend. Some of these new political forces, even ones like the RSP that rose on an anti-establishment wave, they're now being accused of using cyber armies, basically online groups, to intimidate opponents, spread disinformation.
Wait, that sounds familiar, like the old party's tactics. Youth force, things like that.
Exactly like the old playbook, the Youth Force, the Young Communist League. It highlights this really dangerous cycle.
Tools of liberation becoming tools of suppression.
Precisely. The very digital tools that enabled this independent activism can be co-opted by new players to shut down dissent, mirroring the authoritarian tendencies they claim to oppose.
So the challenge for young Nepalis is huge.
It's critical. Can they break free from the old parties without just, reproducing their worst habits in a new guise? The sources suggest it's a really complex struggle unfolding right now.
Okay, so we've got this energetic, tech-savvy generation. They have clear, pragmatic goals, a state that works, basically. But what's the reality they hit when they try to make it happen?
It's a pretty harsh reality, unfortunately. The sources point to this deep, pervasive disillusionment.
How deep?
Well, one figure says 83% of young people believe political leaders are only concerned with their own petty interests.
83%?
Yeah, meaning personal gain, power games, not the country's development. They see a system just stuck in corruption, what some call kleptocratic governance.
Leaders enriching themselves.
Basically, yes. And then there's the gerontocracy problem we touched on. Politics dominated by leaders in their 60s, 70s, even 80s.
Creating a massive generation gap.
Huge gap. A leadership that feels completely out of touch with a young, modern population. Added to that, frequent government changes, often just opportunistic shuffles, leading to policy inconsistency, slow growth.
So it's the overall feeling, optimism.
Quite the opposite, widespread pessimism. Almost two-thirds of young people, according to the data, think the country's heading the wrong direction. And trust in political parties, it's rock bottom, lowest among all government institutions.
It really sounds like they're hitting these walls of the old guard, not just a generation gap, but real structural barriers.
Absolutely. The barriers are systemic, deeply rooted. First, you've got legal hurdles. The Constitution actually sets quite high minimum ages for candidates.
Really? Like what?
21 for local elections, 25 for provincial and federal roles, and get this 45 for positions on constitutional committees.
45.
45. And the sources describe this as a convenient excuse for older politicians to hang on to power. A legal barrier to entry.
Okay, what else?
Then there are the political and structural barriers. Running for office costs a lot of money. It makes participation a dream beyond reach for most young people, unless they have cash or connections.
Favors the insiders.
Definitely. And the traditional parties. They talk about youth. They use their youth wings for rallies, for mobilization.
Foot soldiers again.
But they seem very reluctant to actually hand over leadership roles. They keep young people out of the real decision-making rooms. And then there are societal attitudes sometimes underestimating what young people can do politically.
And all these barriers add up.
They add up to that stark statistic we mentioned. Youth are over 40% of the population, but hold under 5% of federal parliament seats. Way below the global average.
So, thinking about these systemic challenges, what really stands out to you? I mean, how hard is it for a new generation to genuinely break through these kinds of entrenched structures, not just in Nepal, but maybe elsewhere too?
Well, looking at the state's reaction in Nepal, it's ambivalent, contradictory even. On one side, you see outright suppression.
Like with hashtag enough is enough.
Exactly. Peaceful protesters met with police batons, water cannons, arrests. It shows this sort of knee-jerk reaction from the establishment to crush independent, unmanaged activism. And as we said, even the parties sometimes use their youth wings to intimidate opponents. They prefer controlled engagement.
That's the stick. What's the carrot?
The carrot is this attempt to engage youth, but strictly on the state's terms. They'll organize things like the Nepal Youth Summit.
Right, get the leaders in the room.
Yeah, the prime minister, the president show up, they make declarations, pledge to listen to youth voices. It feels very much like a classic state strategy, doesn't it?
Managed dissent.
Exactly. Suppress the unpredictable stuff happening on the streets, but then channel youth energy into these controlled official forums. It lets them look responsive, concerned.
While neutralizing the real threat?
Potentially, yes. We've even seen examples where party leaders apparently silence their own student unions if they get too independent. It's all about maintaining control.
So to pull it all together,
I think you have to say, Nepal's youth, large, tech-savvy, deeply disillusioned, they've clearly become the country's most potent force for change. They've really shifted from being just party foot soldiers
to independent activists.
Independent activists, yes. And they successfully channeled that widespread discontent into that political earthquake in the 2022 elections.
And looking ahead, Nepal's future seems to hang right in that balance, doesn't it? Bridging that huge gap.
That's the core issue. It's the gap between the very pragmatic hopes of this new generation for a functioning state, jobs, opportunities, and this political system that seems built to resist change. Stuck with the gerontocracy, the corruption, all those barriers we discussed.
What do the sources suggest might happen? What are the scenarios?
They lay out a few possibilities. The most likely, perhaps depressingly, is continued political instability.
Meaning?
Meaning new youth-oriented parties might just get sucked into the same old patronage system. Or maybe they stay in opposition but become disillusioned. And the brain drain. That just continues, eroding Nepal's potential.
Okay, what's a more hopeful scenario?
Less likely, the sources say, but possible. A genuine political transformation, where these new forces actually manage to break the old mold, leading to better governance, real economic opportunities.
Which could even reverse the brain drain.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Finally start to harness that demographic dividend. But there's also a clear risk flagged.
What's the risk?
If the system just keeps failing this generation, if disillusionment becomes totally entrenched, it could lead to even more instability. It could undermine faith in democracy itself, potentially opening the door for more radical or even regressive movements.
But one thing's clear, right? The energy is there. The engagement from young Nepalis is undeniable.
Absolutely undeniable. They aren't just waiting for the future. They are, right now, active agents of change, as the sources put it.
So the massive question hanging over Nepal's leadership, and really it resonates for leaders everywhere facing similar youth bulges and tech shifts, is this. Are they going to keep seeing this powerful youth movement primarily as a threat that needs to be managed, controlled? Or will they finally see it as maybe the nation's single greatest asset, something to be nurtured, supported, brought in for the country's very survival as a stable, prosperous democracy? It really makes you think, doesn't it, how these same dynamics might be playing out maybe differently, maybe similarly in other places around the world.